right. So everybody seeing the title slide here? Okay. Okay, great, fantastic. Thank you. And I wanted to thank Jen and Claudia so much for inviting me to be here with you all tonight. And it's a really great book, and I'm looking forward to talking about the art, some of the art references in here. It really is very rich with visual art references. And I'm also tying a lot of the works that I've chosen to look at and to some of the themes about both text within visual art. So you'll see a lot of kind of coming back to those ideas of remixing and borrowing and using history from the past in the present, because there are still these resonances that are really important. So I'm going to divide this kind of into sort of hors d'oeuvres, main dinner, and dessert here. So the main dinner will be the main part of it. And we're going to look at the works that are mentioned that are by the artists that are typically in the canon. If you've had an art history course, a general art history course, you probably are familiar with most of the artists that'll be in my first section. The second section, those are the artists that Amir discovered that he didn't get a chance to, he wasn't exposed to in his art history class. And so this is something that needs to be worked on in my own field. And so we're going to look at those artists in more depth. And then I'm going to finish by looking at a handful of artists that are using a sort of remix philosophy that's like the one that Amir is using in the book. And so we can maybe cogitate imaginatively on what Amir was doing, if it's anything like what some of these other artists are doing. So the first work here that I wanted to introduce us into the topic by is by an artist, Titus Kaphar, and he is just up the road from where a lot of you are, up there in New Haven, and he did a really important TED Talk, Can Art Amend Art History? And so what he says is his whole strategy is not about destroying the path, tearing it all down. The reality is that in order to make what I make, I have to study and understand this traditional technique of making paintings before I alter and revise it, in order that I could say something about where we are in the moment. So I think this is a good introduction, and I really encourage you to search out, it's on YouTube, his TED Talk, in which he takes a painting that he has made. You could see him in front of the painting down here in the bottom left. So he's made that sort of based on a Franz Hals painting that he talks about. And then he goes and he covers the painting as we're watching his TED Talk. And this is in order so that he can bring forth the figure that is so far hidden in the background of Hall's painting, the figure of the Black person, to show that this Black person was there and that they are within history. So this is really important to what a lot of artists are doing and what Amir is having to do himself. So part one here. So these are some of the works. There are also key terms throughout the book that reference art very generally. The authors make reference to expressionism and cubism. So there's sort of some generic styles that are referenced, but also some very specific works and thinkers. And some of these are in the headings of some of the poems in there, and some of them are embedded within the writing itself. So the thinker is one. And then he mentions the Black Mona Lisa. So most people are probably familiar with the Mona Lisa, but there also is a tradition of the Black Madonnas. And so I'm thinking this is sort of a conflation of those ideas with the Black Mona Lisa. He mentions Picasso's face. So I brought in a couple of images here of faces, and we'll see that the artist Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden and Faith Ringgold and other artists that are mentioned in the book go back to the work of Cubism, and especially of Picasso. And Guernica, this is another work by Picasso that's mentioned. It's very large, and this is one that both Lawrence and Bearden would have been able to see, and Norman Lewis, even though his work is even more abstract, would have been able to see in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, at the time. The Last Judgment is mentioned in the book, the Sistine Chapel. So I brought in the most famous image here, the creation of Adam. There are two chapters, two sections called The Scream, and we have two different versions here. And then he also mentions the slave ship, and this is one of those references that you can be thinking, connecting to the physical ships that brought the people that were to be enslaved on. It is also Willie Cole is a contemporary artist who references slave ships in his work, but probably the most famous one in the canon of art history, as it's traditionally been taught, is this work by Joseph Mallord William Turner. And he also penned, he was a abolitionist. England both outlawed slavery and the slave trade before the US did. And he penned a poem that was shown with this. And that's what I have over here on the side. The phrase entombment is used 3 times in different chapters here. So I've brought in a grouping here of several different entombments. Lamentation is related to the idea of entombment. And you can see here in the background, the cave that will be the tomb and the stone that will close it off. And Rembrandt is also mentioned within in the book as well. Dali is mentioned in there, surrealism, and specifically the persistence of memory. And I brought in the melting watch, which is not specifically mentioned, but it does bring in the butterfly and that idea of metamorphosis and transformation, which is important in the book. And then he mentions St. Peter in prison, and that's another reference that can be art historical. The most famous being the Brancacci Chapel. Most people are familiar with Masaccio up here, but over here on the edges, part of the arch is this work here of St. Paul visiting St. Peter in prison, and this is specifically the Mamertine prison in Rome, and so that's what we're seeing on the right. So those are works that in a typical art history course, as it's been taught in the United States, you would be more likely to encounter. So we're going to look at some other works, but first I wanted to say that within the book, Amir mentions artists that are 20th and 21st century artists, but there is a history of Black fine arts, as well as, of course, artisans and crafts created by Black people in the pre-United States. And so we see here Scipio Moorhead. He did a painting that this engraving came from for the frontispiece of Phyllis Wheatley Peters' poems. We could see Elizabeth Catlett, mid-20th century, borrows it, and it's recently been made into a memorial in Boston. So I just don't want people to think that Black art starts in the 20th century. But Jacob Lawrence, born in 1917, and he worked in series. And he talked about this work. And for him, you needed a series in order to say everything that he wanted to say. And so it's a connective narrative, he said, one that's sequential in nature, conceptualized as multiple images functioning together to convey an intended meaning. And so I've just got 2 images here that are part of a series that he did on Toussaint Louverture. And Lawrence's parents were migrated from the South. He was born in New Jersey and he lived in Harlem, grew up there. He did after school work there and started learning art. He worked with Charles Alston, who was a really important linchpin in Harlem in the painting world. Jacob Lawrence was able to get a job working with Alston to do murals during the WPA years for the Federal Art Project. So he did that. He worked odd jobs as well. He also had a couple of extra years of training in the arts. And he also knew and worked with Augusta Savage. So she's an important African-American sculptor. And she's the one that actually helped him to get this, to get into the WPA work in a section for doing easel paintings. And so this is part of a series of 41 works that he did. And there was a local man Professor Seifert, who was a avid historian, and he encouraged Lawrence to go to the local library. Now part of the Schomburg collection. It's really well known, vast materials of African Americans, the diaspora. And so he was studying history there. And he was learning about Toussaint Louverture, who he'd never learned about. So like Amir, he felt there was this big gap in his education. And so that's his springboard for this series. And Louverture was in Haiti and leads this revolution that allows Haiti to become the first free republic of Black people. And so this is a really important turning point. And the image we see on the right is from a print series that's based on the original painting. We have one of the original paintings on the left, but on the right, he later would revisit this in a series of 15 prints. So that's why it's dated 1989. And we could see he's a master of color and of pattern. And he called his style dynamic cubism. Dynamic cubism. And you could see this wonderful repetition of form if you look at those sort of medium blue hats and how they are repeated. And we have Louverture, who is in the front, and so his is more upright, and the others, you could see how fast they're going, and the repetition of the horses and repetitions of the various colors. And yet we could still tell, you know, who is sort of the main figure with his white horse here. And he worked in other series. He had a series dedicated to Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, which these two paintings are from. The Migration series, we'll look at some works from those, and The Life of John Brown, a war series, and more. And by using the series, he's able to talk about the sort of whole tumult of emotions, the joy of children here that are doing handsprings and running on the beach. And also people that are enchained, enslaved, brought close up so we cannot look away from what's happening, and the fact that these people have to move together. And this dream as he talks about. And so these titles, the text is really integral to the images and understanding of the message that he wants to make. And his wife, who was also an artist, Gwendolyn, she also worked with him in working on the titles. And so this is his most famous series. It's a series of 60 paintings. The Migration of the Negro. Now I believe that the Phillips collection calls it of African Americans, but this was the original terminology used at the time. And so this series, 30 of them are in the Phillips collection in DC, and 30 are in New York. And so he uses a sort of tempera, so it gives it a flat surface. It's not oily or luminescent, glistening like oil painting is. And again, we could see the repetition. There's some wonderful videos that you could see of Jacob Lawrence talking about this at the Phillips Collection's own website. And he talks about the trains, and you can see here, the filled with migrants, but he wanted to get across this idea of being on a train, that rhythm that you're on when you're on a train. And he expresses that by the texture that we see here, the repetition of the seats, the colors that bring us then through the image. And he points out both good things that happen up north, as well as the bad things that happen during the Great Migration. So discrimination is still to be found, and he makes that clear on the image on the right. But he also talks about opportunities and education. And this is something that he was very passionate about, is that you could get education here. There were more opportunities. And he wanted to show this very much in a formal way. And so he has these three young women here. Notice their arms are up, echoing each other. Notice each one raises a little higher, and that 2, 3, 4. And so this upward striving that he's suggesting through this work. And then he went to World War II. So he was there. Most of the units were segregated. He was actually, after people realized he was an artist, he did art for the war effort. He was in Italy, and India was where he served. And when he gets back, he gets a Guggenheim Fellowship. So this is very prestigious. And with it, he paints the war series. And something that's really important is he is inscribing for all time in this visual manner the fact that Black people served their country. There was the double V initiative that a number of newspapers, Pittsburgh Courier, sort of started, in this idea that there is victory for freedom abroad, but victory here on the home front. And so this is part of that effort of victory on the home front, seeing the men's valor during the war effort. And he was actually in a Coast Guard unit. And if we look at the one on the right, what we're seeing is that there's a white man and a Black man both here on a stretcher and moving forward, and actively involved with a grenade here in the war effort. So an eyewitness testament to this. And he has a very, very long, very productive life. He does this ordeal of Alice. So this is during the Civil Rights Movement. You see 1963. So this is the year of the March in Washington. And this is about the young students who are integrating into the school system and the horrors that they are undergoing at the time. And so Alice here, we see her as a Saint Sebastian type who's been shot through with arrows. And yet Saint Sebastian is tended to and recovers. So will that happen here with Alice? And he also was very much a humanist. He was very involved in trying to tell the story of Black people, especially in the United States, but his work reached wider than that. And so later he does illustrations for a book that's about Hiroshima and the dropping of the bomb. And so he's showing us these skeletal figures of these children here in this particular image. Somebody who is a friend of Jacob Lawrence. They lived, they had studios very close to each other for quite a while, is Romery Bearden. And Bearden also started in a social realist style, you can see here. And he himself actually was part of the migration up north. So his family came from North Carolina, and Yeah, his family came from North Carolina, but he would spend time with family, go back there from Harlem, and then also go to Maryland, and then he had family in Pittsburgh. So he went to a number of major centers. So he knew rural life, he knew city life, and he's able to bring those out, and he references these throughout his lifetime, these various experiences that he's had. The visitation here is a really important pivotal work in 41. He's been, as had Jacob Lawrence as well, to a major exhibition that had been in 1935 at the Museum of Modern Art on African Art. And so he's looking at African masks, bringing those in, thinking about abstraction. Again, he's influenced by Cubism. We could see the flatness of the background here. The way that the red becomes very much a shape with just a few dark areas within it. And so this is helping him work into a more abstract mode that he will move forward with. And the visitation also has religious connotations. So Mary, pregnant with Christ, going to visit her cousin here. And so we will also see that religion and religious rituals, especially within the Black community, that's a touchstone for Bearden's work as well. And Bearden, he didn't, not until the 60s when he retired was he able to fully commit himself full-time to his artwork. He worked in the New York City's Department of Social Services. He taught art classes. He went to college. He did work as an illustrator. He also wrote music. So he's also very much involved in jazz, and had a studio above the Apollo Theater. So these are all things that play into his work style. And so here we have some more of his some abstract works. There's an entire series here around 1945 and just after. And then he takes some time off. After 1945, he spends more time working on his music. Of course, he still has his full-time job working in the social services area. And then in 63, he forms with some of his friends, and especially Norman Lewis and several other people, a group called Spiral. And spiral is the idea of spiraling ever upward and outward. They were trying to figure out how Black artists could have representation in galleries, how their work could be more fully recognized at the time. So that was one of the goals of this group, Spiral. And it came together in 1963. And Bearden was he was an art historian, philosopher. He went and studied at the Sorbonne in France for a little while. And so they're bringing these philosophical ideas with them to the civil rights movement and to what the arts could do. And one of the things that he suggested was, can we maybe do some collaborative artwork? And people were excited about this, but so he brought in a whole bunch of magazines and wanted people to work together, and they were like, nah, not really interested in it. But he took that idea and really ran with it. And so he's using cutting out images from a variety of sources, especially Ebony and Jet and some of the pop culture magazines that Black people would have, that were subscribing to and would be in their homes. And so he's bringing those together with paint and then also with pencil. So these are really multimedia. And then he would actually put on a type of of shellac on it. And so they would make this and then flatten it so that they would be quite heavy and sturdy. And so he takes all of these collage parts that are brought together from all these sources and really makes them become one. And we can look at his work and get the sense of, okay, we're looking at people here, they're gathering, what they're doing. Here we have the ritual, prevalence of ritual of baptism. So there's water down here. We could see a little bit of a water, the water coming, cascading down, and figures gathering together. So we can make out a lot of what's happening. He has things that happen in the city, things that happen in the country. But they're very complex. This figure here, can you all see the pointer I'm using or not? Okay. There are 6 different parts, six different magazine parts that are put together to make this particular image. And so it's this idea of assemblage, of, again, a remix of what's coming into people's homes and making it into fine art, transforming this into something that becomes this idea of this prevalence of ritual, as he calls it. And he has a series of 3. Later, he will make those into prints as well. And so that's what you're seeing on the right is this reworked into a print. And so the ritual of the prevalence of ritual baptism that he's doing here, in this, again, abstract collaged way, using images of African masks and other things. He also then will blow up through a photographic process where you photograph onto the actual print material. And these are very large, and he called these projections. And so he would show these in galleries, and they would make this enormous visual statement about what was happening. And take them from the color image that he had that would usually be 12 by 18, sometimes a little bigger, and make it into something that, again, is black and white, like a lot of the reproductions he was starting with. Excuse me. Later on, he would started this series here called The Return of Odysseus. So looking at this historical tale that had been told verbally and then finally recorded in a written form. And so he's working that into a visual form. And it's referenced by, when he went to Italy, he saw some work by Pinturicchio, and that influenced him, as did works from Benin. So bringing together both European, mainly white traditions, and he wants to change those figures into figures that have faces that are black rather than the white faces of Pinturicchio's, and then bringing in the Benin bronzes as well, or Benin ivory, I should say, I'm sorry, bringing that in. And so that's an entire series, and we can see that ivory over here in the bottom. So that's, again, one of those things that comes back quite often, as does the visitation. He references that several times in his career, but this is the only time he includes it with himself. So it's really important that he actually was profiled in a magazine, and so he's thinking about this idea of profiles. And he does a series based on this where he's looking back over his career and thinking about when he traveled down to North Carolina in the 40s here. And he includes that in this image of the artist and painting with his model. He's got a work here by Duccio, so an Italian Sienese artist. Here we see part of the cutout, and if we look closely on the back of the chair, we could see he's arranged it, the gray there on top of the brown, so we could see the cutout portion. And we can find that if we look up here at his hand resting on top. I should use my other hand here. I don't know which way it's projecting to you guys. But here we could see that his hand is resting on top of the Visitation. He has the model in the studio, and then he has his drawing. He's got his pencil out here, and he's got a drawing of this ivory that was so important, as well as a drawing of the model that is shown in here. So very much self-referential, like a collage, bringing all these things together through time as well and space as well into this one image to tell us something about him personally. And again, we see that collage aesthetic that he uses. And Norman Lewis, part of the same group, part of Spiral as well. He becomes the first vice president of it. And he seemed to have been involved in pretty much every, I guess I shouldn't say every, but he was involved in a lot of different artistic groups over time, very instrumental in starting a lot of them, as well as in being an active member of them. So he too, his family had come from Bermuda. He grew up in Harlem. So again, and he was a founding member of the Harlem Artists Guild in the 30s. And then he, in that period, which we're looking at here, he's again looking at social realism, participating in that style. Then he moves into a more abstract style as well. As we see in the Harlem Gate of 45, we could see even more abstraction in the 50s there. He joined the Harlem 306 group, which was really important for him. It was mainly Black artists, but also some white artists, but there were people from the theater field and the dance field and poets and a lot of creative thinkers as well. And so he felt this was it was a really wonderful group for him because he was able to exchange ideas. And so he would carry this forward, joining other artistic groups. Stay here for just a minute. He joined, one of the groups he was in was called Studio 35, a really important group. He was the only African-American in it. And this is the group that decides to call abstract expressionism. So he is very much formative part of this. Adolf Gottlieb, Hans Hofmann, Robert Motherwell. He's friends of Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner. His closest friend is Ad Reinhardt. So he is there, and yet, until relatively recently, if you looked at abstract expressionism, you really don't find Norman Lewis in there, even though he was very much formative in that period. And so he had been written out of a lot of the histories, erased from them. This work that we're looking at on the left, really powerful work, fairly often reproduced, it's called Evening Rendezvous. And what we're looking at, you know, if you've noticed, you could see that you've got red, white, and blue. So we've got these colors associated with patriotism. And the white figures down here are actually KKK members in their white robes. And that bright white is the glare of the headlights that would be shown off their robes. The red in the center are the bonfires, and the blue is the smoke echoing, you know, outwards. And so this is, even though it's abstract and it's very difficult to make these pieces out, we know that this is coming out of his engagement with the civil rights movement, which he was very active in, you know, during that period, but also active in the rights of Black Americans prior to that. He paints the March on Washington, which is in 63. You can see this dated a little bit after this. And it was between this period in 63 that group Spiral is brought together. He also did a series that was just black and white. And these he spoke about later. We have some transcripts of an interview that was done fairly late in his life. And he talks about these in relation to Selma and the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge there in Alabama. And he talks about the black and white people together. And we get that sense here of something that's happening in space, even though it's quite abstract. We could look at it and say, oh, we've got two triangles that are cut off, you know, but we could see here, we could walk this way, and then this whole group of people processes, and he talked about these as processional paintings going this way. We also see embedded within it, again, that triangle that references in white that references the KKK. And then but he also talked about, you know, that there were black and white people working together at this point. In '69, with Bearden, he started the Cinque Gallery. So an important gallery to represent Black Americans at the time. And then this work here, Confrontation, is about the civil rights protests and about the protesters and police clashing. And he titled it, as you can see here, Confrontation. Another artist that Amir finds through and mentions in the book is Faith Ringgold. So we're able to, and she was a Black feminist artist, and she very much is influenced by Cubism. She's influenced by African art, and she also, she travels, she spends, she has a couple of trips where she goes to Africa, especially Nigeria. She also goes to France with her mother and her daughters. So this whole matrilineal line, and she travels there. But she is deeply influenced by Cubism. And we see here in the self-portrait that Cubist element in her art, and also in work called Big Black light paintings. And something she starts exploring is getting away from chiaroscuro, the idea of shade, darks and lights. What in, you know, if you're an art student, you were taught very early on, you have to have the darks and the lights in order to make something look three-dimensional. And what Ringgold was working towards in her paintings is that people with dark skin, that doing chiaroscuro didn't work the way she wanted to work in images. And so she felt that if she would apply, like work she had seen in Africa, apply flat areas of color and shapes and forms, she could get something that to her expressed the idea of Black features better. And so that's what she's playing with. You note at this point, you can see that she's not using white in these images. Even in the what we call the whites of the eyes, they're actually blues or sort of lavender color that we're looking at. The background here, it has been compared to a large African shield, but it also is reminiscent of Picasso's, there's a woman looking into a mirror. So bringing together these different traditions in her work. And her first big public project is this one called For the Women's House. It was at the women's area of the Rikers Island Correctional Center. And she went in and spoke with the women about what did they want the art that was going to be in their walls to say, what was important to them. And so that is what she what she took into her work here. And she said her intention was to broaden women's images of themselves by showing women in roles that have not traditionally been theirs, and to show women's universality by painting a work which crosses the lines of age, race, and class. And so she's used these triangles, which actually come from a form of art, Kuba cloth. And so she uses that. So again, an African form that she brings in, and she shows a woman of color who's president, and then brings in Wilt Chamberlain and the Knicks, so 2 women basketball players, policewoman and construction woman, a white woman who has a child of mixed race. And they are reading here Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King's works. Drumming, this was something that women did not do. And so she shows a woman drumming. And here we just see a hand. And that hand is a woman's hand. That is the reverend or preacher who is marrying the woman. We don't see who she's marrying, and her mother is giving her away here. We also see a Black woman who's a doctor and who is teaching the next generation, who is also a Black woman, and a white woman shown as a bus driver. So trying to show different types of career opportunities. And later on, this would be painted over, but there was actually, it then was conserved, and the colors are back the way we see them. So Faith Ringgold is most famous for her story quilts. And so here we have Dancing in the Louvre. And so she's telling the story of William Marie Simon, who is she goes to France in the 20s, and these very active children enjoying life here in the halls of the Louvre. And then we also have this work here in Picasso's studio as a model. And while it seems like she becomes objectified in here, if we look at the text, what we see is that something that the words, as she's looking at Picasso painting her, that she says it's the African mask straight from African faces that I look at in Picasso's studio and in his art. Has the power to deny what he doesn't want to acknowledge, but art is the truth, not the artist. Doesn't matter what he says about where it comes from. We see where every time we look in the mirror. So again, turning this space that is mostly white, mostly male, into a space that females can see themselves in. And a couple more of her quilts, famous Black women here, inscribed into history, Van Gogh's Sunflowers. And I just brought this in, Tar Beach, because this might be a book that you've either read with your kids or that the library has here. So Alma Thomas, another woman who well-trained, 1924, she gets her bachelor's degree at Howard University, the first ever in the visual arts. She then goes on to Columbia, gets a master's degree in education. She then helps to co-start a gallery. The next decade, she takes classes at American University in DC in the 50s. It's not until she retires that she actually really starts her career in her own painting. And she is an artist that works in abstraction. And she was really, it fired her imagination to think about going to the moon. And so this image here, Snoopy sees Earth wrapped in the sunset. Snoopy is what the astronauts were calling some of the technology. And so we see that and the eclipse here. And again, the stars, Orion, she's thinking about those and something that looks almost like it's a textile. And she's part of the Washington Color Group. Painting, and then we see here the abstraction. So nature was one of the most important things for her. So she's part of this group. Sam Gilliam is probably one of the most well-known people, Kenneth Noland, and but her work has this touchstone of nature and this wonderful, almost glowing surface here that's layered in her work, and you can almost feel the wind in these crepe myrtles. And Carrie James Marshall, another artist, a contemporary artist, who is painting here, these large paintings. He wants to be in museums because he talked about, until his work gets in a museum, that people, especially Black kids, Black people, don't have a chance to see themselves in the art represented in the museum spaces, and museums aren't neutral spaces. And so that was really important for him. This is in the Art Institute up in Chicago. And he's building on the grand history paintings like Jericho, because if you can see this, he sees the structure and he wants to borrow that structure so that we see it as a grand history type of painting. And here he talks about this one that's in the National Gallery. All of these books are books that he and his wife own about African and African-American and African diasporic history and painting and culture. And he leaves us with this sob. Is she upset because she knows how much Black people have contributed? Does she, but it's not recognized? What is she upset about? And so we have this, this important work here that he's trying to both place it and non-place it. He actually designed the clothing because he wanted something that didn't look like it was from the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. He said it's the first time he designed clothing, but he wanted something that didn't scream a particular era. And so that this painting would still have resonance into the future, just like Renaissance paintings still have resonance. That is what he wants for his work here. And this is a relatively new work of his that we're looking at, Untitled. And he makes his faces, he makes his figures large, so we have to look at them. And he makes his faces, when you look at them closely, there are changing tonalities, but like Faith Ringgold, he's thinking about, you know, how Black faces read, and he wants us to see them, to understand and to reckon with them, to both recognize and not recognize things. Here we're looking at what's called the underpainting. He stripped away the top layers so that we see how a painting is constructed. And that's what he wants us to do. Paintings are constructed. History is constructed. And here, the last artist, and there are 3 chapters named for Basquiat, Charlie Parker with his saxophone. So he starts like Andy Warhol, who he was good friends with an image there. We could see a drawing that he does. And he returns to Charlie Parker throughout his life. Music was very important, jazz and contemporary, rap music at the time. And here is a work that is bringing together those things. And again, text is important. He is part of a group, he and another man named themselves Samo, and they are tagging, and this is a post-graffiti. Graffiti enters the gallery at this time. And he was in a terrible accident when he was a child and had to have his spleen removed. He was hit by a car. So he was reading Gray's Anatomy. And he's bringing these sort of skeletal images into his work. Bringing the text in, looking at Leonardo. So again, bringing these different sources together in order to remix, recreate. And we see in this final section here, Titus Kaphar, who is working today. Again, he's got a MacArthur Genius Award, and showing us things that maybe we don't want to see. And he's not trying to show us the actual Sally Hemings. He's shown a woman who, Sally Hemings was known to be very light-skinned. So he's showing us a darker skinned woman, but as an odalisque, somebody we look at. And so we're peeling away the layers of paint, and that's through the canvas, drawing the blind down. And so he cuts his surfaces of paintings. He folds them. He puts tar on them. Billy Lee and Ona Judge, they were enslaved people owned by the Washingtons, George Washington and his wife Martha. And they are referenced. They were known in their period. They were talked about, but we don't know what they look like. So he rewrites them into history visually because we don't have that. But he also makes this very tactile reference here that through putting tar on here, that we have to see them. We have to try to figure out what's going on. He also works in sculpture. Again, we have a woman we understand to be Sally Hemings coming out of this to relook at history, see what we see today in the figures of these young Black women and historically. Here is a relatively new young artist, Harmonia Rosales, and she also is working in this way. She did the creation of Adam, and here the birth of Ocean. Some of you may have seen some of Beyonce's work, so there's a couple of references here that you can make to that. And again, she's working from through history, and again, bringing in Black women. And her figures of Black women, they are from very light skin all the way to very dark skin. Various women's physiognomies, women that look like real women. And she is again trying to show us them throughout history. Gehendi Wiley. This is after Northern Renaissance work. Stained glass windows. Reworking people like Winslow Homer here. And most of his models are people that he finds look interesting. He wants to put them into his work. He does do commissioned portraits, and of course, President Obama's is his most famous work. But he's got several series here. And this one, perhaps most famous of the moment, is the Rumors of War. So this is at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And so all of those men on horseback, the Confederate monuments, and there was a whole Confederate monument row there. Wiley goes to Virginia and Richmond and doesn't see himself, and is commissioned and does this work. And it's based around a group of paintings that he had earlier done. And the last artist, I wanted to really bring us back to idea of text. And this is a young poet, Quentin Baker. And he is here in the gallery. These are enlarged works from a Senate hearing about a slave ship and a rebellion on the ship, the Creole. And it was the only record of it is in Senate papers. So he has gone through and erases them. And it's called Ballast. So referencing the ship again, something he didn't know about, he didn't learn about. And so he is bringing those into the museum space through his, what he calls erasure poems. And his erasure poems are on this small cabin. So this is here in St. Mary's College in Maryland. They did some excavations. They were going to put a football field here. And what they discovered is that in this archaeological dig is that they did have slave houses there. And so they contacted an architectural firm to build this. You cannot go inside this. This is sacred space. This is space that we are not allowed into. And Quentin Baker's poems appear on the outside. And at night, the poems, the light comes through here and we can read the poems, but also read them on the ground as it, to make us very much aware of it. And there was a wonderful dedication ceremony and website that is all about this commemorative to enslaved people that you can go see. And Quentin Baker reads one of his poems. It's incredibly powerful and very moving. And thank you.